very important to understand that, one, science was not totally in favor of the atomic bomb, and that there's this tremendous amount of protest that grew up around it, and we needed to discuss that issue. The Manhattan Project itself was a major project. It was under military command in the United States of America. It was scattered all over the continent. When the Americans chose to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, remember, both cities were civilian targets, which violated international law right then and there. The war was over in Europe. The Soviet Union had told the Americans and the British that they will then start to amass their troops on the Manchurian border, and they would make an attack into Japanese-held territory on the 12th of August. The Americans were already in negotiations with Japan from the spring forward for their surrender, and they were just quibbling over whether or not the emperor was going to be left in position. Those were in process. The dropping of the atomic bomb was a demonstration to the USSR that the Americans had this weapon of mass destruction. There was the American Army sent in a film crew, and with their color cameras, they took all these wonderful shots of the destruction and the problems and horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 35 years later, they're some of them on their deathbeds, dying of cancer brought on by the radiation that they received, applied under the Freedom of Information Act in the United States of America, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, and they finally got those films released. And the Americans, right up to that period, were not allowing for protests to happen or information to get out, but it was leaking out bit by bit. One of the problems is that in Japan was that up to 1951, it was still under military rule of the United States of America. So protests had to be consented to by the Americans. And they actually tried to ban a memorial in 47 or 48 for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the people still went there out of respect to their ancestors. And so you have, coming out of World War II, you have these two big mass movements. One is the human rights movement, and the other is the peace movement. And the struggles that they went through. If you were for peace after World War II, you must have been a communist. And so that whole blacklisting protest really destroyed the scientists inside the Manhattan Project. The vast majority of people who were of any one occupation that were called before the House of Un-American Activities were the scientists. They were trying to destroy that movement from within, and from without, they did a very successful job. There is one scientist who was a German. He was actually the spy that provided information to the Soviet Union. He quit the Manhattan Project and went to work in England because he didn't like the environment there, but he got caught spying in England, and he did 10 years in British jails for that. There was the hysteria of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. There were a couple. He worked as an electronics firm. He was befriended by a Russian diplomat. That Russian diplomat actually wrote his autobiography after the breakup of the Soviet Union. He applied for permission to go back into the secret files of the diplomatic and spy agencies. And he wrote his autobiography, and he said categorically, Ethel Rosenberg had nothing to do with any spy operation whatsoever. Julius Rosenberg did provide some information about the electronics in his business that he was working at. He actually provided him with what was called a proximity trigger. When your weapon gets in proximity to the vessel, it explodes rather than having to make contact with the vessel. The hysteria that was around Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, how terrible they were, and the evidence that they started concocting to make it fit. But that was the time. They had to smash this left wing, whether it be communist, socialist, and then when they started working on the liberals started to rise up and say this is all wrong. They had succeeded in smashing, beating down that public protest until about March 1st in 1954. And that is the day when the Americans were trying to blow another hole in the Bikini Atoll using a hydrogen bomb, and they underestimated the power of the weapon, and it exploded, and all of the dust got up in the atmosphere and drifted outside of the area that they called the protective zone. It landed on one island, the Marshall Islands, and the Americans raced over there and rescued their 28 American citizens who were working at a weather station, and ignored the native population. There's a couple hundred native population there. And then 3 or 4 days later, well, I think we should go back and take a look at these people. And they did, and they found them all suffering from nuclear disease. They managed to successfully bury that. But what they couldn't bury was a small fishing boat, Lucky Dragon, which was 85 miles from the test site. It had 23 crew members on it, and it was a Japanese boat. And by this time, Japan had been outside of American martial law. They knew what about the effects of radiation. When the captain managed to get his vessel back to port 2 weeks later, the whole crew was suffering from nuclear sickness. The one person, the radio operator, died. And the Japanese people just rose up in total horror that when you're testing these nuclear weapons into the atmosphere, you're broadcasting that throughout the whole world. And from then on, you can see this building of the movement in every country around the world. We say, oh, we look at milk that we get in this corner store, and they're doing tests on it and finding that it was full of strontium-90 from the nuclear radiation from the surface test, atmospheric testing. And then you see this struggle. Then the scientists come out and start speaking out about it. I brought an article here by Einstein. Einstein was, the person of the century. He also wrote this lovely little article called "Why Socialism," published in Monthly Review. It was the lead article, the very first article of that magazine. And it's a Marxist magazine. And it's "Why Socialism." But soon after he wrote that article, and actually that was written in 49, about 54 or 55, he sat down with Bertrand Russell, and they wrote the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which was the calling on the scientists of the world to sit down and let's discuss this issue. Out of that grew the Pugwash conventions and meetings. And Cyrus Eaton, who was a Canadian born in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, he moved to the United States. He made himself a fortune as an industrialist. He financed bringing Soviet scientists and other scientists together in Pugwash to discuss mutual issues of concern. Mr. Pauling was a chemist by trade. He was invited 3 times to go to Europe to talk on the peace issue, but 3 times the American government refused to give him a passport. The Swedish government gave him a Nobel Prize in chemistry, and they could not refuse to give him a passport then. Then in about 64, he also won a second Nobel Prize in peace. He's the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes as a solo person. The second Pugwash was also held in Canada, and then the Canadian government started leaning on Cyrus Eaton that they didn't want it to happen again in Canada, and it was moved to other locations around Europe and whatnot. But it actually brought the scientists together. They were understanding the issues, building on it, and building a peaceful. You saw peaceful demonstrations out of, like in England, the Aldermast meetings, marches, which is, Bertrand Russell was part of the organizing committee on that. And they would mass people to walk on towards Aldermaster Air Force Base, which was storing nuclear weapons, and quietly confront the authorities. You've got hundreds of thousands of people doing this. They tried to do that in Greece, but the Greece government decided that it was too political and would refuse to allow the Greeks to do that. The only person that could make the full walk was a member of their national parliament, and he was excluded from prosecution under such things. 6 months later, he disappeared and was murdered by the military regime that was in making. And that was the process, the confrontation process that was happening. Other countries started saying, do we want nuclear testing on our sites? Australia was a testing site for Great Britain, and they said no. Other countries were saying, do we want nuclear weapons on our soil? And Norway and Sweden said no, and the governments listened to the protest that was coming up from below. Other countries continued the process of trying to suppress it and deny free speech issues. And by about 1958, the end of the decade, there was a desire to, there had to be a demonstrative act by somebody to break the ice. And the Soviet Union offered up a unilateral cessation of atmospheric testing, which embarrassed the Americans, so they came on board. Embarrassed the French and the British, they came on board. But the French decided that they were going to break the testing, and they did an atmospheric test, and then everybody else went back to testing. But we had this first agreement in principle without it being an agreement at all. It was just unilateral acts. The critical thing happened in the early 60s, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the world almost came to a nuclear war over the stationing of weapons on Cuba. And I like to think of it not as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the Cuban-Turkey crisis. Because by that time, Turkey was a member of NATO. The Americans were offering weapons to all the NATO allies. Many of them were saying no. Turkey accepted it. Turkey's border is up to Georgia, which is part of the Soviet Empire, Soviet Union. And so you have this, right smack dab on the border of the USSR were these nuclear weapons, and 90 miles away in Cuba were these nuclear weapons from the United States of America. That spy master who handled the Rosenthal case, he was also back in Washington, again as a diplomat. He negotiated the backdoor agreement that with an American that they would, the Soviet Union would publicly withdraw their weapons from Cuba, and 6 months later the Americans would quietly withdraw their weapons from Turkey. But we were very, very close to a nuclear war. The scientist community, they had various groups within it, actually had a clock, midnight being the end of the Earth, and they actually put it up to about 1 minute towards the end of the Earth. That's how close it was. And if it wasn't for the public protests within all these countries, with the scientists speaking out, we would probably have gone smoking. It's a long way.